You see me here today, a 79-year-old woman with silver hair and hands that tell stories of decades lived. But what you can't see is the journey that brought me to this moment. A journey that began in the summer of 1965, when I was just 19 years old. No idea that the man I was about to call family would become my greatest nightmare. My name is Margaret, but everyone has always called me Maggie. What I'm about to share with you happened over 50 years ago, but some wounds never fully heal. They just teach you how. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I was born Margaret Rose Thompson in 1946 in Cedar Falls, Iowa, a town where cornfields stretched endlessly toward the horizon, and everyone knew everyone else's business. My father, Robert Thompson, owned Thompson's hardware store on Main Street, the same store his father had opened in 1923. My mother, Dorothy, was the town's beloved piano teacher, known for her patience with even the most tone-deaf children and her famous apple pie that won the county fair 3 years running. We lived in a modest two-story house on Elm Street, painted white with blue shutters that my father repainted every other spring. It was the kind of childhood you see in old movies: bicycle rides to the soda fountain, summer evenings catching fireflies, and winter afternoons sledding down Miller's Hill behind the Methodist Church. In 1965, Cedar Falls was still caught between two worlds. The old ways, where a woman's highest aspiration was a good marriage and well-behaved children, and the new winds of change that were beginning to blow across America. I was caught in that same tension. Part of me dreamed of college and a career, while another part accepted that my path would likely lead to marriage and motherhood, just as it had for my mother and grandmother before her. I had just graduated from Cedar Falls High School, where I'd been salutatorian of my class and editor of the school newspaper. My teachers encouraged me to apply for a scholarship to the state university, but my parents, while proud of my achievements, gently steered me toward more practical considerations. "Education is wonderful, dear," my mother would say while hemming one of my dresses. "But a woman needs to think about her future security." That future seemed to arrive in the form of Daniel Mitchell in June of 1965. I met him at the Independence Day celebration in the town square, where the local band was playing patriotic songs and families had spread blankets for picnics under the ancient oak trees. Daniel was visiting his aunt, Mrs. Eleanor Mitchell, who lived in the big Victorian house on Highland Avenue. At 23, he seemed impossibly worldly to my 19-year-old eyes. He had just finished his business degree at Northwestern University and spoke of opportunities in the growing suburbs around Chicago. Daniel was everything a young woman in Cedar Falls could hope for: tall and handsome with kind brown eyes, impeccably polite, and from a good family. The Mitchell name carried weight not just in Cedar Falls but throughout the region. His grandfather had founded Mitchell Construction Company in 1935, and by 1965 it had grown into one of the most successful building firms in the Midwest. Daniel's father, Thomas Mitchell, had expanded the business to include real estate development, and they were riding the wave of post-war prosperity that was transforming small American cities. Our courtship unfolded like something from a romance novel. Daniel would drive the 2 hours from Chicago every weekend in his gleaming blue Ford Mustang, bringing flowers for my mother and always asking my father's permission before taking me anywhere. We'd walk through the town square, share ice cream sodas at Murphy's drugstore, and talk for hours about books, movies, and our dreams for the future. What struck me most about Daniel was his genuine interest in my thoughts and opinions. Unlike the local boys I'd known, who seemed to view conversations with girls as pleasant but ultimately unimportant diversions, Daniel listened when I spoke about wanting to write, about the stories I'd always carried in my head. "You should pursue that," he would say, his eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. "There's no reason a wife can't also be a writer." By August, Daniel had asked my father for permission to marry me. The proposal itself happened on a warm evening in late summer, as we sat on the porch swing at my parents' house, watching the fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. "Maggie," he said, taking my hands in his, "I know we haven't known each other long, but I can't imagine my life without you. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The ring was beautiful, a modest but elegant solitaire that had belonged to his grandmother. As I looked at it sparkling on my finger, I felt like the luckiest girl in the world. Here was a man who loved me, respected me, and offered me a life of possibilities I'd never dared dream of. Our engagement was celebrated throughout Cedar Falls. My mother immediately began planning what she called the wedding of the century, at least by local standards. The guest list grew daily as neighbors and family friends insisted on being included. Mrs. Mitchell, Daniel's aunt, took a special interest in the preparations, offering advice on everything from flowers to music with the authority of someone who had attended society weddings in Chicago. It was during these planning sessions that I first heard about Daniel's family in detail. His parents, Thomas and Patricia Mitchell, lived in an elegant home in Lake Forest, one of Chicago's most prestigious suburbs. Thomas was described as a brilliant businessman who had taken his father's modest construction company and built it into an empire. Patricia came from old Chicago society. Her family had made their fortune in steel during the industrial boom of the early 1900s. But it was when Mrs. Mitchell mentioned Daniel's younger brother that I felt the first tiny shadow cross my sunny future. "Oh, and you'll love Jonathan," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "He's such a charming boy, though quite different from Daniel. More spirited, you might say." Jonathan Mitchell was 20 years old, just a year older than me, and still in college at Northwestern. From the family photographs Daniel showed me, he looked remarkably similar to his older brother. The same dark hair and strong jawline, the same confident smile. But there was something in Jonathan's eyes in those pictures, a kind of intensity that made me slightly uncomfortable, though I couldn't have explained why at the time. "Jonathan's always been the wild one," Daniel explained with the fond tolerance of an older brother. "He's incredibly smart, maybe smarter than me, but he's never quite figured out what to do with himself. Dad worries about him sometimes, but I think he just needs to find his direction." As our wedding date approached, we had set it for October 15th, when the Iowa autumn would be at its peak. I found myself both excited and nervous about meeting Daniel's family. They would be arriving 2 days before the ceremony, staying at the Grand Hotel downtown. It would be my first time meeting the people who would become my new family, and I was desperate to make a good impression. My mother had sewn my wedding dress herself, a creation of ivory silk and delicate lace that had taken her 3 months to complete. As she made the final adjustments in early October, pinning and tucking until the fit was perfect, she shared her own wisdom about marriage. "The key to a happy marriage, Maggie," she said around a mouthful of pins, "is respect. Love is wonderful, but respect is what lasts. Remember that you're not just marrying Daniel. You're joining his family. Be kind, be gracious, and always remember that family comes first." I nodded solemnly, taking her words to heart. I had grown up in a close, loving family where disagreements were rare and always handled with gentle discussion. I assumed that all families operated the same way, that the warmth and stability I'd known at home would simply transfer to my new life with Daniel. The night before the Mitchell family was due to arrive, I lay in my childhood bed for what I knew would be one of the last times, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine my future. In my mind, I painted pictures of a happy marriage, children playing in a beautiful home, holiday gatherings with extended family, and perhaps, if I was very lucky, time to pursue my writing. I fell asleep that night filled with hope and anticipation, completely unaware that my life was about to take a turn that would test everything I thought I knew about family, love, and my own strength. The young woman who closed her eyes that night in Cedar Falls would never exist again. In her place would emerge someone harder, wiser, and ultimately stronger. But the price of that transformation would be higher than I could have ever imagined. Tomorrow, the Mitchell family would arrive, and with them would come Jonathan, the man who would shatter my innocent world and force me to discover reserves of courage I never knew I possessed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Mitchell family's arrival in Cedar Falls on October 13, 1965, was an event that had the entire town talking. Their convoy of 3 black Cadillacs pulled up to the Grand Hotel just as the afternoon shadows were growing long, and I watched from Murphy's drugstore across the street as uniformed drivers unloaded expensive luggage and garment bags. Thomas Mitchell emerged first from the lead car, a man in his early 50s, who commanded attention without saying a word. He was taller than Daniel, with silver threading through his dark hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from decades of successful business dealings. His suit was clearly expensive, tailored perfectly to his frame, and when he spoke to the hotel manager who had rushed out to greet them, his voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Patricia Mitchell stepped out next, and I understood immediately why Mrs. Mitchell had spoken of her with such reverence. Even after hours of travel, she looked impeccable. Her blonde hair styled in a perfect bouffant, her navy dress unwrinkled, her pearls catching the afternoon light. She moved with the grace of someone who had been trained from childhood in the art of making an impression, surveying the small-town scene with polite interest that bordered on condescension. But it was Jonathan who captured my attention and held it. He unfolded himself from the second car with a fluid grace that reminded me of a cat. There was something predatory in the way he moved, a barely contained energy that seemed at odds with his family's composed demeanor. At 20, he was nearly as tall as his father and brother, but where they carried themselves with steady confidence, Jonathan seemed to vibrate with an intensity that made the very air around him feel charged. His resemblance to Daniel was striking, but where Daniel's features spoke of kindness and reliability, Jonathan seemed sharper, more defined. His dark eyes swept across the town square with undisguised amusement, as if he found the entire scene quaint and entertaining. When those eyes briefly met mine across the street, I felt an unexpected jolt of unease. Not fear exactly, but a recognition that this was someone who saw the world very differently than I did. Daniel had arranged for us to meet at my family's home that evening for dinner. My mother had been cooking for days, determined to present the Mitchell family with a meal that would do justice to the occasion. The house smelled of roast beef and fresh-baked rolls, and she had brought out her best china, the set that had been a wedding gift from her own mother and was only used for the most special occasions. When the Mitchells arrived at 6 o'clock sharp, they brought with them an energy that transformed our modest living room. Thomas immediately engaged my father in conversation about the hardware business, asking thoughtful questions about inventory management and supplier relationships that demonstrated a genuine interest in understanding how different businesses operated. Patricia complimented my mother on everything from the flower arrangements to the doilies on the end tables, though I detected a subtle note in her voice that suggested she was being deliberately gracious rather than genuinely impressed. Jonathan, however, seemed to exist in his own orbit. While his parents made polite conversation, he wandered around our living room, examining family photographs and my mother's collection of ceramic figurines, with the focused attention of someone cataloging details for future reference. When he picked up my high school yearbook from the coffee table and began flipping through it, I felt compelled to explain myself. "I was editor of the school newspaper," I said, moving to stand beside him. "It wasn't much compared to big city papers, but I enjoyed the writing." He looked up at me with those intense dark eyes, and for a moment, I felt as though he was seeing something in me that others missed. "Writing is important," he said quietly, his voice carrying a warmth that surprised me. "Most people don't understand the power of words, the way they can shape reality." He paused on a page that showed me receiving an award for a series of articles I'd written about local veterans. "You have talent, I can see it in these pieces." His unexpected praise made me flush with pleasure. Here was someone who seemed to understand my ambitions in a way that even Daniel, despite his encouragement, sometimes struggled with. "Thank you," I said. "That means a lot coming from someone who's studying literature." Jonathan's smile was brilliant and completely engaging. "Maybe we could talk more about writing sometime. I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of the contemporary authors." There was nothing inappropriate in his words or manner, but something about the way he looked at me made me feel suddenly self-conscious, as if I were being studied rather than simply conversed with. Dinner proceeded smoothly, with Thomas regaling us with stories of the construction business and the opportunities he saw in the rapidly expanding suburbs around Chicago. "The future is in planned communities," he explained, cutting his roast beef with precise movements. "People want modern homes with all the latest conveniences, but they also want the security of knowing their neighbors, the sense of community that's being lost in the big cities." Patricia spoke eloquently about the cultural opportunities available in Chicago, the symphony, the art museums, the theater district. Maggie will love the Symphony Center, she said, turning to include me in the conversation. We have season tickets, and I'm sure she'll find the programs quite enriching. Throughout the meal, I was acutely aware of Jonathan's presence across the table from me. He participated in the conversation when asked direct questions, but mostly he seemed content to observe, his dark eyes moving from speaker to speaker, with the intensity of someone recording every nuance for later analysis. Several times I caught him watching me specifically, and when our eyes met, he would smile that brilliant smile that made me feel both flattered and oddly unsettled. After dinner, while my mother served coffee and her famous apple pie in the living room, Jonathan asked if he could see the garden my father had mentioned during dinner. I'd be happy to show you, my father offered, but Jonathan's response surprised everyone. Actually, I was hoping Maggie might give me the tour. Daniel's told me so much about her gardening skills, and I'd love to hear about it from the expert herself. There was nothing unreasonable about the request, and Daniel nodded encouragingly. Go ahead, sweetheart, show him Mom's roses. They're spectacular this year. The October evening was crisp but pleasant, with the last of the autumn flowers still blooming in my mother's carefully tended beds. Jonathan walked beside me along the garden paths, asking thoughtful questions about plant varieties and seasonal care that demonstrated genuine interest. Under the soft light from the kitchen windows, away from the formal atmosphere of dinner, he seemed more relaxed, more like the younger brother Daniel had described. You know, he said as we paused beside my mother's prize-winning rose bushes, I envy Daniel sometimes. Envy him? I asked, surprised. Why? Jonathan turned to face me fully, and in the dim light, his expression was more serious than I'd seen it all evening. He always knows exactly what he wants. The right career, the right girl, the right life path. Everything falls into place for him so easily. He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. I've never had that kind of certainty about anything. There was something vulnerable in his admission that touched me. Despite his confident exterior, Jonathan suddenly seemed very young, very much like the uncertain college student he actually was rather than the sophisticated young man he appeared to be. I think most people our age feel that way, I said gently. I certainly do. Sometimes I wonder if I'm making the right choices, if I'm becoming who I'm supposed to be, or just who everyone expects me to be. His eyes sharpened with interest. Exactly. That's exactly what I mean. You understand. He stepped closer, and I could smell his cologne, something expensive and distinctly masculine. I have a feeling you and I are going to understand each other very well, Maggie. Something in his tone made me take a small step backward, though I couldn't have explained why. I hope so, I said carefully. Family is important to Daniel, and that means it's important to me too. Family, Jonathan repeated softly, and something in the way he said the word made it sound like both a promise and a threat. Yes, we're going to be family very soon, aren't we? Before I could respond, Daniel's voice called from the back door. Everything okay out there? Mom's brought out the photo albums. She's determined to embarrass Maggie with baby pictures. Coming, I called back, grateful for the interruption. As we walked back toward the house, Jonathan fell into step beside me, close enough that our arms occasionally brushed. Each contact sent an unexpected jolt through me. Not attraction, exactly, but a heightened awareness that left me feeling confused and slightly off balance. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of family photographs, wedding planning discussions, and polite laughter. But as the Mitchells prepared to leave, returning to their hotel for the night, I found myself replaying that conversation in the garden, trying to understand why Jonathan's words had affected me so strongly. Your future brother-in-law seems very interested in you, my mother observed later as we cleared the coffee cups and dessert plates. Her tone was casual, but I detected a note of something. Not quite concern, but careful observation. He's just being friendly, I replied, though even as I said it, I wondered if that was entirely true. He seems like he might be a little lonely, being away at college and all. My mother nodded thoughtfully. The Mitchell family seems very nice, she said finally, though I get the impression they're used to getting their way. That night, as I lay in bed reviewing the evening, I found myself thinking not about my upcoming wedding or my excitement about starting a new life, but about Jonathan's intense dark eyes and the way he'd said the word family in the garden. There had been something in his voice, something that suggested he saw possibilities in our future relationship that went beyond the simple bonds of marriage and family connection. I told myself I was being silly, reading too much into what had been nothing more than a friendly conversation between future in-laws. But as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted that evening, that some invisible line had been crossed that would change everything that came after. Tomorrow was my wedding day, and I was determined to focus on the joy and excitement of marrying Daniel. But Jonathan's words echoed in my mind. "I have a feeling you and I are going to understand each other very well." I had no idea how prophetic and how terrifying those words would prove to be. October 15th, 1965, dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that made everything look like it belonged in a painting. The maple trees around Cedar Falls had turned to gold and crimson, creating a backdrop so perfect it seemed almost orchestrated for my wedding day. As I stood in my childhood bedroom, watching my mother make final adjustments to my veil, I felt like I was living in a fairy tale. The ceremony at First Methodist Church was everything we had planned, and more. The sanctuary was filled to capacity with nearly 300 guests. It seemed like the entire town had turned out to witness the union of the pharmacist's daughter and the Chicago businessman's son. My dress rustled softly as I walked down the aisle on my father's arm, past faces I'd known all my life toward Daniel, who stood waiting at the altar with tears in his eyes. Jonathan served as best man, looking handsome and distinguished in his formal mourning coat. As Daniel and I exchanged vows, I was vaguely aware of Jonathan's presence to my left, but I was too caught up in the emotion of the moment to pay him much attention. When Daniel slipped the gold band onto my finger and promised to love and cherish me for the rest of our lives, I felt complete in a way I never had before. The reception at the Cedar Falls Community Center was a celebration that would be talked about for years to come. Thomas Mitchell had insisted on hiring a band from Chicago, and they filled the decorated hall with music that had people dancing late into the evening. The cake, 3 tiers of vanilla and chocolate with buttercream roses, was a masterpiece that my mother had ordered from the finest bakery in Des Moines. Throughout the evening, I was swept up in a whirlwind of congratulations, dancing, and photographs. Thomas made a toast that spoke eloquently about the joining of 2 families and the bright future that lay ahead for Daniel and me. My father's toast was simpler but deeply heartfelt, expressing his joy at seeing his daughter marry such a fine young man. When it came time for Jonathan to speak as best man, he rose with that same fluid grace I'd noticed when he first arrived in town. His toast was perfect, witty without being inappropriate, affectionate without being overly sentimental. He spoke about Daniel's qualities as a brother and friend, about the luck Daniel had found in winning my heart, and about his hopes for our future happiness. But as he spoke, his eyes found mine across the crowded room, and there was something in his gaze that made me feel suddenly warm and uncomfortable, as if he were sharing a private joke that only the 2 of us understood. "To Daniel and Maggie," he concluded, raising his champagne glass high, "may your love story be everything you've dreamed and more." The assembled guests raised their glasses and drank, but I found myself looking down at my bouquet rather than meeting Jonathan's intense stare. After the reception, Daniel and I left for our honeymoon at a resort in the Wisconsin Dells. The 3 days we spent there were blissful, long walks through the autumn woods, quiet dinners by candlelight, and the joy of finally being alone together as husband and wife. Daniel was gentle and patient, everything I had hoped he would be, and by the time we returned to Illinois to begin our new life, I felt confident that I had made the right choice. Daniel had purchased a house for us in Oak Brook, a developing suburb about 30 miles west of Chicago. It was a beautiful split-level home with 4 bedrooms, a modern kitchen, and large windows that looked out on a yard where we could plant gardens and maybe, someday, watch children play. The neighborhood was full of young couples like ourselves, and I quickly made friends with several other wives who were also adjusting to suburban life. Thomas had given Daniel a promotion within Mitchell Construction, putting him in charge of residential development projects. It was challenging work that required long hours, but Daniel threw himself into it with enthusiasm. He left early each morning in his suit and tie, briefcase in hand, looking every inch the successful businessman. I felt proud watching him walk to his car, knowing that he was building something important, creating the kinds of communities where families could thrive. My own days were spent settling into our new home, learning to cook more elaborate meals, and beginning to explore the cultural opportunities that Chicago offered. Patricia had been true to her word about including me in her social circle. I was invited to ladies' luncheons, charity committee meetings, and afternoon teas where I met the wives of other successful businessmen. These women were kind and welcoming, though I sometimes felt like I was playing a role in a sophisticated play for which I hadn't quite memorized all the lines. The first few months of marriage were everything I had hoped they would be. Daniel and I fell into comfortable routines, discovered shared interests we hadn't known about, and began making plans for the future. We talked about children, about travel, about the possibility of building a larger house once Daniel's position at the company was more established. I even began writing again, working on short stories in the afternoons when the household tasks were finished. Jonathan was away at Northwestern for most of this time, but he came home frequently for weekends and family dinners. These gatherings usually took place at the senior Mitchell's house in Lake Forest, an imposing Georgian mansion that never failed to intimidate me slightly. The dining room could seat 12 people comfortably, and Patricia always set the table with china and crystal that probably cost more than my father made in a month. During these family meals, Jonathan was always charming and appropriate, discussing his studies, asking about Daniel's work, and treating me with the kind of respectful attention one would expect from a brother-in-law. But I began to notice things. The way his eyes would linger on me when he thought no one was looking. The way he would find reasons to brush against me when passing in hallways. The way he would steer conversations toward topics that seemed designed to showcase his intelligence and sophistication. It started innocently enough. Jonathan would ask about my writing, expressing genuine interest in the stories I was working on. He'd recommend books he thought I might enjoy, often bringing them as gifts when he came for visits. These were thoughtful gestures that any sister-in-law would appreciate, and I told myself that I was lucky to have married into a family where intellectual pursuits were valued and encouraged. But there were moments that made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't quite articulate why. The way Jonathan would compliment my appearance. Nothing inappropriate, just observations about how well a particular color suited me or how I'd styled my hair differently. The way he would monopolize my attention during family gatherings, drawing me into conversations about literature or current events while Daniel was occupied with business discussions with his father. The first incident that truly alarmed me happened during a dinner party at Thomas and Patricia's house in February 1966. The Mitchells had invited several business associates and their wives, and the evening was proceeding as usual. Cocktails in the living room, followed by an elaborate dinner and brandy afterward for the men, while the women retired to the parlor for coffee and gossip. I had excused myself to use the powder room and was returning through the dimly lit hallway when Jonathan appeared, seemingly from nowhere. He had been drinking, not heavily, but enough that I could smell the whiskey on his breath when he stepped closer to me than was appropriate. "Maggie," he said quietly, his voice carrying a warmth that made me instinctively take a step backward. "I've been hoping for a chance to talk to you alone." "About what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light and normal, though my heart had begun beating faster. "About us," he said simply, as if those two words explained everything. "About this connection I feel between us. I know you feel it too." I stared at him in shock, my mind racing to find an appropriate response. "Jonathan, I don't know what you mean. We're family now, and I care about you as Daniel's brother. But it's more than that," he interrupted, stepping even closer. The hallway suddenly felt impossibly narrow, and I realized that we were completely alone, out of sight and hearing of the other guests. "From the moment I saw you in Cedar Falls, I knew you were different. Special. Wasted on someone like Daniel." "Don't say that," I said firmly, my shock giving way to anger. "Daniel is your brother, and he's my husband. I love him." Jonathan's smile was condescending, as if I were a child who didn't understand the complexities of adult relationships. "Love," he repeated softly. Such a simple word for such a complicated emotion. "Tell me, Maggie, are you truly happy? Really fulfilled?" Or do you sometimes feel like you're sleepwalking through someone else's life? The question hit too close to home. There were indeed moments when I felt like I was playing a role rather than living authentically, when the suburban housewife persona felt like a costume that didn't quite fit. But hearing Jonathan voice these doubts made them feel dangerous, like secrets I shouldn't have shared even with myself. "I'm very happy," I said as firmly as I could manage. "And I think you've had too much to drink. We should get back to the others." As I tried to move past him, Jonathan's hand shot out and grasped my wrist. Not painfully, but firmly enough to stop me from leaving. "Don't walk away from me, Maggie. Not when we're finally being honest with each other." "Let go of me," I said quietly, but with steel in my voice that surprised even me. For a moment, we stood frozen in tableau. Jonathan holding my wrist, me staring at him with a mixture of fear and determination. Then voices drifted from the living room as other guests moved about, and Jonathan released me immediately, his expression shifting back to the charming smile I knew so well. "Of course," he said smoothly, as if nothing had happened. "I apologize if I've made you uncomfortable. It wasn't my intention." But his eyes told a different story. There was satisfaction there, as if this brief encounter had confirmed something he'd been wondering about. I rejoined the party on shaking legs, my mind reeling from what had just occurred. For the rest of the evening, I stayed close to Daniel, participating in conversations but unable to concentrate fully on anything being said. Jonathan behaved perfectly normally, charming the other guests and showing no sign that anything unusual had happened between us. On the drive home, Daniel asked if I was feeling well. "You seemed quiet tonight," he said, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "Did you have a good time?" I wanted desperately to tell him what had happened, to share my confusion and concern about his brother's behavior. But how could I explain something that sounded so innocent on the surface? How could I describe the way Jonathan had looked at me, the implications in his words, without sounding paranoid or overly dramatic? "I'm just tired," I said finally. It was a lovely evening. That night, as Daniel slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I misinterpreted Jonathan's words? Had I been overly sensitive to what might have been nothing more than a brother-in-law's genuine interest in my well-being? But even as I tried to rationalize the encounter away, I knew that something fundamental had shifted. Jonathan had revealed something about his feelings, or at least his intentions, that could never be taken back. And I had the sinking feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger problem that I had no idea how to handle. The fairy tale beginning of my marriage was over. In its place was a new reality that included secrets, doubts, and the growing certainty that the man I now called family had plans for me that had nothing to do with the traditional bonds of marriage and family loyalty. Spring of 1966 brought changes that should have filled me with joy, but instead carried an undercurrent of dread I couldn't shake. Daniel received another promotion at Mitchell Construction, this time to Vice President of Residential Development, which meant longer hours and frequent business trips to potential development sites across the Midwest. His success made me proud, but it also meant more time alone, time that Jonathan seemed increasingly eager to fill. Jonathan had finished his spring semester at Northwestern with honors, earning a degree in English literature, with a minor in philosophy. Instead of immediately pursuing graduate school or finding employment, he announced at a family dinner that he wanted to take some time to explore his options and, quote, gain real-world experience. Thomas, though clearly disappointed that his younger son wasn't following a more traditional path, agreed to let Jonathan work in various departments at Mitchell Construction to learn the business from the ground up. This arrangement meant that Jonathan was now a regular presence in our suburban world. He rented a small apartment in downtown Oak Brook, claiming he wanted independence while he figured out his next steps, but he spent most evenings at our house, often arriving just as Daniel was leaving for business trips or staying late at the office. "I don't want Maggie to be lonely while you're away," he would tell Daniel with that charming smile that everyone found so disarming. "Besides, she's helping me understand the practical applications of literature in the business world. Her insights are incredibly valuable." Daniel, grateful that his wife and brother were developing a close relationship, actively encouraged these visits. "It's wonderful that you two get along so well," he would say, kissing me goodbye before heading to the airport. Jonathan's always been the intellectual in the family. I'm glad he has someone who appreciates that side of him. If only Daniel knew what those intellectual conversations actually entailed. Jonathan had become masterful at creating situations where we would be alone together, always with plausible explanations that couldn't be questioned without seeming paranoid. He would arrive with books he wanted to discuss, manuscripts he was working on that he claimed needed a feminine perspective, or business proposals that he said required my fresh eyes to evaluate properly. These sessions would begin innocently enough. We'd sit in the living room with coffee or tea, discussing Hemingway's latest novel, or debating the merits of various poets. Jonathan was genuinely brilliant. His analyses were insightful and thought-provoking, and despite my discomfort with his underlying motivations, I found myself intellectually stimulated in ways that my suburban life rarely provided. But as the weeks passed, these conversations became increasingly personal and inappropriate. Jonathan would steer the discussion toward relationships, marriage, and what he called the authentic self versus the societal role. He seemed fascinated by what he perceived as the contradiction between my intellectual interests and my domestic life. "You're extraordinary, Maggie," he said during one such evening in late May, as we sat in my carefully decorated living room discussing Virginia Woolf. "You have this brilliant mind, this deep sensitivity to language and meaning, and yet you're content to waste it on grocery lists and dinner parties." "I'm not wasting anything," I replied firmly, though his words stung because they echoed my own secret doubts. "I'm building a life with my husband, there's value in that." Jonathan leaned forward in his chair, his dark eyes intense. "But is it your life, really? Or is it the life everyone expects you to live?" He paused, letting his words sink in. "When you write your stories, what do you write about? Suburban housewives finding fulfillment in perfectly arranged dinner parties? Or do you write about women trapped in golden cages, dreaming of something more?" I felt my cheeks burn because his assessment was uncomfortably accurate. My recent stories had indeed been about women struggling with the limitations of their prescribed roles. Women who felt suffocated by the very security they were supposed to cherish. But hearing Jonathan articulate these themes made them feel dangerous, like secrets that should never have been put into words. "My writing is private," I said carefully. "And my marriage isn't a cage." "Isn't it?" Jonathan's voice was soft but insistent. "When was the last time Daniel asked about your stories? When did he last read something you'd written and discuss it with the passion you deserve? When did he last look at you the way I'm looking at you right now?" The way he was looking at me made my pulse race with a combination of fear and something else I didn't want to acknowledge. There was hunger in his gaze, but also a kind of recognition that made me feel simultaneously seen and violated. "Stop," I said quietly, standing up from my chair. "This conversation is inappropriate, and you know it." Jonathan rose as well, moving with that fluid grace that always reminded me of a predator. "Inappropriate according to whom?" "According to the rules that say a woman should be satisfied with half a life, because it's the proper thing to do." He was standing too close now, close enough that I could smell his cologne and see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. When I tried to step back, I found myself against the mantelpiece with nowhere to go. "You feel it too," he said softly, reaching out to touch a strand of my hair that had come loose from its careful arrangement. "This connection between us, this recognition of what we could be together if we had the courage to reach for it." "No," I said firmly, pushing his hand away. "What I feel is loyalty to my husband and respect for my marriage. And if you can't respect those things, then these visits need to stop." For a moment, Jonathan's charming mask slipped, and I saw something cold and calculating in his expression. Then the smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course," he said smoothly. "I apologize if I've misread the situation. That wasn't my intention." But as he gathered his books and prepared to leave, he paused at the front door. "Just remember, Maggie," he said quietly, "I know who you really are underneath all this suburban perfection. And someday, you're gonna want someone who sees and appreciates that person. When that day comes, I'll be here." After he left, I locked the door and leaned against it, my heart racing. I knew I should tell Daniel what was happening, but how could I explain something that sounded so ambiguous when described in words? Jonathan was careful never to cross lines that would make his behavior undeniably inappropriate. Instead, he operated in the gray areas of implication and suggestion, always maintaining plausible deniability. The next morning, I received a delivery that made my blood run cold. It was a book, a collection of love poems by Pablo Neruda, with a note tucked inside the front cover. For someone who understands the power of words to reveal truth, until we can speak honestly about what exists between us. J. I should have thrown the book away immediately, but instead I found myself reading the poems Jonathan had marked with small pencil dots in the margins. They were passionate, intense works about forbidden love and the agony of desiring someone you couldn't have. The implication was clear. Jonathan saw our situation through the lens of these dramatic romantic narratives where societal constraints were obstacles to be overcome, rather than boundaries to be respected. That evening, when Daniel returned from a 2-day trip to survey potential development sites in Missouri, I almost told him everything. But as he described his successful meetings and shared his excitement about the company's expansion plans, I realized how much our problems with Jonathan would complicate his life. Daniel was finally hitting his stride professionally, earning his father's respect and proving himself capable of handling major responsibilities. How could I burden him with family drama that might force him to choose between his brother and his wife? So I said nothing, and Jonathan's visits continued. But something had changed in their dynamic. Now there was an undercurrent of threat beneath his intellectual discussions, a sense that he was biding his time and building towards something that I didn't want to contemplate. He began bringing up Daniel's business trips more frequently, mentioning how often I was left alone, how a young woman in my position might feel isolated and underappreciated. It must be difficult, he would say with false sympathy, being married to someone whose career always comes first. Do you ever feel like you're competing with Mitchell Construction for your husband's attention? These comments were designed to plant seeds of doubt about my marriage, and I hated that they sometimes found fertile ground in my own insecurities. There were indeed times when I felt secondary to Daniel's professional ambitions, when I wondered if he saw me more as an asset to his career than as a partner in building a life together. The situation came to a head in early July, when Daniel announced that he would be traveling to California for nearly 2 weeks to negotiate a major development deal. It was the longest he'd ever been away, and the trip represented a significant opportunity for advancement within the company. I hate leaving you for so long, he said as he packed his suitcase the night before his departure. Maybe you should go stay with your parents in Cedar Falls while I'm gone. The suggestion was tempting, but I had commitments in Oak Brook, a charity committee meeting, a ladies' luncheon I was helping to organize, and several other social obligations that I couldn't easily cancel without causing offense within Patricia's social circle. I'll be fine, I assured him, though even as I said it I felt a chill of apprehension. Besides, Jonathan's nearby if I need anything. Daniel smiled, completely unaware of the irony in his relief. That's true. I'm glad he's here to look out for you. As I watched Daniel's plane disappear into the morning sky the next day, I had the unsettling feeling that I was watching more than just my husband depart. It felt like I was saying goodbye to the last of my innocence, the final moments of believing that good intentions and proper behavior would be enough to protect me from the storm that was gathering on the horizon. That evening, as I sat alone in our beautiful suburban home, the phone rang. I knew before I answered it that it would be Jonathan's voice on the other end, and I knew that the careful game we'd been playing was about to enter a new and more dangerous phase. "Hello, Maggie," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that no longer fooled me. "I was thinking we should have dinner tonight. After all, we have 2 whole weeks to finally get to know each other properly, without any interruptions." The way he said, "without any interruptions," made it clear that he saw Daniel's absence not as an inconvenience, but as an opportunity. And for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I realized that I might be in more danger than I had allowed myself to acknowledge. I didn't answer Jonathan's call that first evening. When the phone rang at 6 o'clock, I simply let it ring until the sound stopped echoing through my empty house. But 20 minutes later, it rang again, and again at 7. By 8:30, when it had rung 6 times, I realized that not answering was only delaying the inevitable. The 7th time the phone rang, I picked it up with trembling hands. I was starting to worry. Jonathan's voice was silky smooth. with an undertone of amusement that told me he knew exactly why I hadn't been answering. "Did you forget about our dinner plans?" "We don't have dinner plans," I said as firmly as I could manage. "I never agreed to have dinner with you." "Of course you did," he replied with that maddening confidence that made me question my own memory. "When I mentioned that we'd have time to get to know each other properly while Daniel is away, you seemed very interested in the idea." "That's not what happened, and you know it." Jonathan's laugh was low and somehow threatening. "Maggie, sweetheart, you're being silly. I'm family. There's nothing inappropriate about a brother-in-law checking on his sister-in-law while her husband is away. In fact, Daniel specifically asked me to look after you." The way he twisted the situation, making my resistance seem unreasonable while positioning himself as the concerned family member, was masterful manipulation. But I was learning to recognize his tactics even if I still felt powerless to counter them effectively. "I appreciate your concern," I said carefully, "but I'm perfectly fine on my own. I don't need looking after." "Don't you?" His voice dropped to that intimate tone that always made my skin crawl. "Because from where I sit, it seems like you've been lonely for quite some time. Isolated. Underappreciated. Living a life that's far too small for someone with your intelligence and passion. My life is exactly what I want it to be." "Is it?" "Because I've been watching you, Maggie. Really watching you. And I see the way you look sometimes when you think no one is paying attention. Like you're suffocating in all that suburban perfection. Like you're dying a little more each day." His words hit too close to home, touching on feelings I'd been trying desperately to ignore. There were indeed moments when I felt trapped by the very life I'd thought I wanted, when the routine of housework and social obligations felt like a prison disguised as paradise. But hearing Jonathan articulate these doubts made them feel dangerous, like weapons he could use against me. "I'm hanging up now," I said. "Wait." The command in his voice was sharp enough to make me pause. "I'm coming over. We need to talk properly, face to face." "No, absolutely not. I don't want you in my house." "It's not your house, though, is it?" Jonathan's voice had turned cold, calculating. "It's a Mitchell house, bought with Mitchell money, furnished with Mitchell credit. And I'm a Mitchell. That gives me certain privileges." The threat was clear, even though he hadn't stated it directly. He was reminding me that my security, my place in this world, depended entirely on my relationship with the Mitchell family. And he was a member of that family with just as much claim to belonging as I had. "Don't come here, Jonathan. I mean it." But he had already hung up, and I stood in my kitchen holding the dead phone, knowing with absolute certainty that he was already on his way. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? That my brother-in-law wanted to have dinner with me? That he'd made some vaguely threatening comments about privileges and family loyalty? They would think I was hysterical, paranoid, or simply ungrateful for the concern of a family member. I thought about calling my parents in Cedar Falls, but the idea of trying to explain this situation over the phone, of admitting that my perfect marriage and wonderful new life had this dark undercurrent, felt impossible. How could I shatter their pride and happiness without being able to offer any clear solution? Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I locked all the doors, drew all the curtains, and turned off the lights in the front rooms so the house would appear empty. Then I sat in my darkened living room, watching the street through a gap in the curtains, waiting for the inevitable. Jonathan's car pulled into my driveway at exactly 9 o'clock. He sat there for several minutes, the engine running, undoubtedly aware that I could see him and wanting me to understand that he wasn't going anywhere. When he finally got out and walked to my front door, his movements were unhurried, confident. He knew he held all the cards in this particular game. The doorbell rang once, twice, 3 times. Then came the knocking, not urgent or aggressive, but persistent and methodical. After several minutes of this, I heard his voice through the door. "Maggie, I know you're in there. Your car is in the garage, and I can see the light from the kitchen. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." I remained silent, hardly daring to breathe. "I brought wine," he continued conversationally. "That bottle of French Bordeaux you mentioned liking when we had dinner at Mother and Father's. I thought we could share it while we talk about your writing. I have some ideas for stories you might find interesting." Still, I said nothing. You know, Daniel called me from his hotel in Los Angeles tonight. He wanted to make sure I was taking good care of you. He was so grateful that I was here to keep you company while he's away building his career. He specifically asked me to spend as much time with you as possible. He worries about you being lonely. The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity. Jonathan was using Daniel's own concern for my welfare as justification for his predatory behavior. And the worst part was that he was probably telling the truth. Daniel had likely asked his brother to check on me, never imagining how those innocent requests would be twisted. "I'm going to wait right here until you open this door," Jonathan said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "I have all night, and I'm very patient, but eventually you're going to have to face me, and the longer you make me wait, the less pleasant our conversation is going to be." I sat in the darkness for another hour, listening to Jonathan moving around on my front porch. Occasionally I would hear him testing the door handle or trying the windows, always carefully, quietly, like someone who knew exactly what he was doing. At one point, I heard the distinct sound of a key turning in a lock, and my blood ran cold as I realized he must have somehow gotten a copy of our house key. The front door opened with a soft click, and Jonathan's voice drifted through the darkness. "Maggie, I'm here now. There's no point in hiding." I heard his footsteps moving through the entryway, then the living room, as he systematically searched for me. When he found the light switch and illuminated the room where I was sitting, his smile was triumphant but not surprised. "There you are," he said softly. "Why did you make this so difficult?" All I wanted was to have a civilized conversation. He was dressed casually but elegantly, khaki slacks, a white button-down shirt, a navy blazer that emphasized his broad shoulders. In his hand was indeed a bottle of wine, expensive-looking with a French label I couldn't read in the dim light. Everything about his appearance was calculated to seem non-threatening, like a brother-in-law stopping by for a friendly visit. How did you get a key to my house?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Our house," Jonathan corrected gently. "And Father gave it to me when Daniel first bought this place. He wanted to make sure someone in the family could check on things when you two were traveling." He set the wine bottle on my coffee table and settled into Daniel's favorite chair as if he belonged there. Very thoughtful of him, don't you think? I realized that I was trapped not just in this moment, but in a web that had been spun long before I'd even recognized the danger. The Mitchell family's wealth, influence, and interconnected relationships meant that Jonathan had access to resources and justifications that I couldn't counter. Worse, everything he was doing could be explained away as family concern, making my objections seem unreasonable and ungrateful. "What do you want, Jonathan?" I asked quietly. His smile widened, and for the first time it held no pretense of warmth or charm. "I want what I've always wanted, Maggie. I want you to stop pretending that you don't feel the connection between us. I want you to admit that your marriage is a prison disguised as security. And I want you to let me show you what real passion feels like." He leaned forward in the chair, his dark eyes fixed on mine with predatory intensity. "Daniel is never going to appreciate what he has in you. He sees you as a beautiful accessory to his successful life, but he doesn't see the fire underneath. He doesn't see the brilliant, passionate woman who writes stories about escape and freedom when she thinks no one is looking." "You've been reading my stories?" The violation felt almost as shocking as his physical presence in my home. "Of course I have. They're quite good, actually. Full of insight about the female condition, about the gap between what women are expected to want and what they actually need." Jonathan stood up and began moving closer to where I sat on the sofa. "That story you wrote about the woman who fantasizes about disappearing from her perfect life? The one where she imagines what it would be like to be with a man who truly understood her? That was about us, wasn't it?" I wanted to deny it, but the truth was that my recent writing had been influenced by my confused feelings about Jonathan's attention. Not because I was attracted to him, but because his persistent pursuit had forced me to examine my own life and marriage in ways that were both uncomfortable and illuminating. "My writing is fiction," I said firmly. "It doesn't mean anything beyond the story itself. Doesn't it?" Jonathan was standing directly in front of me now, close enough that I would have to push past him to stand up. "I think your writing is the most honest thing about you, Maggie. It's where you tell the truth about what you really want." He reached out and touched my face, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw with a gentleness that was somehow more terrifying than violence would have been. "Stop fighting this," he whispered. "Stop fighting yourself. Daniel is 3,000 miles away, building his career and taking you for granted. No one ever has to know what happens between us while he's gone." That's when I realized that Jonathan wasn't just planning to seduce me. He was planning to assault me. And he'd arranged everything perfectly. Daniel was away for nearly 2 weeks. Jonathan had a key to the house and family authorization to be here, and he'd spent months laying the groundwork to make any accusations I might make seem like the delusions of an unstable woman. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt not just fear but absolute terror, because I finally understood that Jonathan hadn't been building toward a moment of romantic confession or even inappropriate seduction. He'd been methodically constructing a situation where he could take what he wanted from me, and there would be nothing I could do to stop him or seek justice afterward. The charming, intellectual young man I'd thought I was dealing with had been a carefully constructed facade. The real Jonathan Mitchell was something far more dangerous. A predator who used his family's power and his own intelligence to create perfect crimes that would never be recognized as crimes at all. And I was completely, utterly alone with him. In that moment, when Jonathan's true intentions became crystal clear, something inside me shifted from paralyzing fear to desperate survival instinct. When he leaned down to kiss me, his hand moving to pin my shoulders against the sofa, I did the only thing I could think of. I brought my knee up as hard as I could. The impact caught him off guard, and he stumbled backward with a sharp curse. In that split second of advantage, I rolled off the sofa and ran toward the kitchen, hoping to reach the back door before he could recover. But Jonathan was faster than I'd anticipated, and his hand caught my wrist just as I reached the doorway. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he hissed, his charming facade completely gone now. His grip was painful, leaving marks that would bruise by morning. I was trying to be gentle, romantic even, but if you want to play rough... I screamed then, as loudly as I could, hoping against hope that one of my neighbors might hear. But our houses were spaced far apart, built for privacy and the illusion of rural tranquility even in the suburbs. Jonathan's laugh was cold and knowing. "Scream all you want," he said, dragging me back toward the living room. "The Hendersons are in Europe until next month, and the Patricks go to bed at 9 o'clock sharp with their television turned up loud. No one's going to save you, Maggie." What happened next was a nightmare that seemed to last forever, and yet was over in what couldn't have been more than 10 minutes. Jonathan was methodical, almost clinical in his assault, as if he'd planned every detail in advance. When it was over, he straightened his clothes, ran his hands through his hair, and transformed back into the polished young man who could charm anyone he met. I lay on my living room floor, my dress torn, my body aching, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Jonathan stood over me, adjusting his tie with the same careful attention he'd shown when preparing for family dinners. "This stays between us," he said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "If you tell anyone at all, I'll make sure everyone knows that you seduced me." A lonely housewife, desperate for attention while her husband builds his career. Who do you think they'll believe? The grieving victim or the respected son of one of Chicago's most prominent families? He crouched down beside me, his voice taking on that falsely gentle tone I'd come to hate. "Think about it logically, Maggie. You invited me over while Daniel was away. You've been having private dinners with me for months. You write stories about women escaping their marriages. I have those stories, by the way. I made copies. They'll make very interesting evidence of your state of mind." The calculated cruelty of his words was almost worse than the physical assault. He had turned my own creative work, my most private thoughts, into weapons against me. Every kindness I'd shown him, every polite conversation we'd shared, would be twisted into evidence of my complicity. "Your father-in-law trusts me completely," Jonathan continued, standing and brushing invisible lint from his jacket. "Your husband thinks I'm the ideal brother. Your neighbors have seen me coming and going for months. They'll testify that this was clearly an ongoing affair. And you? You're just another unstable woman making accusations she can't prove." He moved toward the door, then paused as if remembering something important. "Oh, and Maggie? I'll be back. Daniel's gonna be away for nearly 2 more weeks. and we have so much more to explore together. I suggest you start thinking about how to make this easier on both of us." After he left, I lay on the floor for what felt like hours, too shocked to move, too devastated to think clearly. When I finally managed to get up, my first instinct was to call the police, but Jonathan's words echoed in my mind. He was right about one thing. Who would believe me? I had no witnesses, no evidence, except my torn dress and the bruises that were already forming on my wrists and arms. And those could easily be explained away as the results of rough consensual sex or even self-inflicted injuries by an unstable woman seeking attention. I stumbled to the bathroom and stood under the shower until the hot water ran out, scrubbing my skin until it was raw, trying to wash away the feeling of his hands on me. But no amount of soap and water could cleanse the violation I felt, the knowledge that my own home had been turned into a crime scene where the criminal would never be prosecuted. The next morning brought a phone call from Daniel. His voice was bright with excitement as he described his successful meetings and the progress he was making on the California development deal. "I miss you so much," he said. "But this opportunity is incredible, Maggie. If I can close this deal, it'll set us up for life." I wanted desperately to tell him what had happened, to beg him to come home immediately, to explain that his brother was a monster who had destroyed our safe, happy world. But how could I shatter his professional triumph with news that would tear his family apart? How could I force him to choose between believing me and protecting his career? "I miss you too," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears. "Jonathan said he stopped by to check on you," Daniel continued. "I'm so grateful he's there to keep you company. He said you two had a wonderful evening discussing literature." The casual way Daniel repeated Jonathan's lies made me feel sick. Even now, less than 12 hours after the assault, Jonathan was already constructing the narrative that would protect him and incriminate me if I ever tried to speak the truth. "Yes," I whispered, "it was quite an evening." "I knew you two would become close," Daniel said warmly. "It means everything to me that my wife and my brother get along so well." After I hung up the phone, I sat in my kitchen staring at the walls of the house that no longer felt like home. Every surface seemed contaminated by Jonathan's presence. Every room held the echo of his threats. I realized that I was trapped, not just by his immediate power over me, but by the entire structure of the life I'd built with Daniel. The next few days passed in a haze of terror and desperate planning. I considered running away, simply disappearing and starting over somewhere else. But where could I go with no money of my own, no career to support myself, no family wealthy enough to protect me from the Mitchell family's influence? I was a 20-year-old woman in 1966, with few legal rights and fewer practical options. I thought about confiding in Patricia, Daniel's mother, but quickly realized how naive that hope was. Even if she believed me, which was unlikely, she would prioritize protecting the family reputation over seeking justice for me. The scandal of a criminal prosecution would destroy everything the Mitchells had built. Jonathan didn't return immediately, but his presence haunted every moment. Every car that drove down our street made my heart race. Every phone call might be him. Every knock at the door could signal the beginning of another nightmare. I stopped eating regularly, barely slept, and jumped at every unexpected sound. A week after the assault, I received a package with no return address. Inside was expensive perfume, the same scent I'd been wearing that terrible night, along with a note that made my blood run cold. "For next time, I know you'll want to smell beautiful for me. Your devoted brother-in-law." The psychological torture of the gift was masterful. It was expensive enough to seem like a generous gesture if anyone else saw it, but the personal message and the connection to that night made it clear that Jonathan was still thinking about me, still planning his next move. Worse, if anyone found the note, it could easily be interpreted as evidence of an ongoing romantic relationship. I threw the perfume away immediately, but the note I kept, hiding it in a place where Daniel would never find it. Some instinct told me that I might need evidence someday, even if I couldn't imagine how or when I might be able to use it safely. The isolation was perhaps the worst part. I had to continue my normal routines, attending church, participating in charity committee meetings, having lunch with the other wives in our social circle, all while carrying this enormous secret that felt like it was poisoning me from the inside. When well-meaning friends asked if I was feeling well, commenting on my weight loss and the dark circles under my eyes, I had to invent excuses about not sleeping well while Daniel was away. "You're so lucky to have such a caring brother-in-law," Mrs. Henderson said during one particularly torturous ladies' luncheon. "I saw Jonathan's car at your house several times last week. It's wonderful that the Mitchell family looks after their own." I smiled and nodded and agreed that yes, I was very lucky indeed, all while feeling like I was drowning in plain sight. Jonathan had been clever about his visits, spacing them out and varying the time so that they appeared random and innocent to outside observers. Anyone watching would see exactly what he wanted them to see. A devoted brother-in-law checking on his sister-in-law while her husband was away on business. 10 days into Daniel's trip, Jonathan called again. This time his voice held no pretense of charm or courtesy. "I'll be over tonight at 8, he said simply. "Be ready for me." "No," I said, though my voice shook. "I won't let you into this house again." "You don't have a choice," Jonathan replied calmly. "I have a key, remember? And I have photographs." "What photographs?" "The ones I took last week while you were indisposed. Very artistic, actually. I'm quite proud of my composition. Would you like me to send copies to Daniel's hotel? Or perhaps to your parents in Cedar Falls? I'm sure they'd be fascinated to see how their little girl spends her time when her husband is away." The phone slipped from my nerveless fingers and clattered to the kitchen floor. Jonathan had photographed me during the assault, creating evidence that would make any future accusations impossible while giving him permanent leverage over me. The sophistication of his planning was breathtaking and terrifying. That night, I didn't try to resist when I heard his key in the lock. I didn't run or hide or fight back when he found me sitting numbly in the living room, waiting for the inevitable. I had learned the most bitter lesson of my young life. Sometimes survival means enduring the unendurable, and sometimes the price of protecting the people you love is sacrificing pieces of yourself that can never be recovered. But even as Jonathan violated me again, even as he whispered new threats and promised this would continue indefinitely, a small flame of resistance flickered deep inside me. I was trapped, powerless, and completely alone. But I was also still alive, still thinking, still capable of hope that someday, somehow, I would find a way to escape this nightmare and reclaim my life. I just had no idea how long I would have to wait for that opportunity, or what price I would have to pay to finally break free. Daniel returned from California in late July with news that changed everything. The development deal had been a massive success, even bigger than anyone had anticipated. Mitchell Construction would be building 3 entire suburban communities outside Los Angeles, a project worth millions of dollars that would establish the company as a major player on the West Coast. "This is it, Maggie," he said, spinning me around our living room with joy. "This is our future. Father's talking about making me a full partner in the company. We can start thinking about a bigger house, maybe children. Everything we've dreamed of is finally within reach." I tried to share his excitement, tried to smile and celebrate this incredible achievement. But Jonathan's recent visits had left me feeling hollow, disconnected from my own life. The bruises had faded, but the psychological wounds felt fresh and raw. Still, seeing Daniel so happy, so proud of what he'd accomplished, made me determined to protect his joy from the poison that Jonathan had introduced into our marriage. "I'm so proud of you," I managed to say, and I meant it. Despite everything, I loved my husband deeply. The tragedy was that Jonathan's actions had created a wall between Daniel and me that seemed impossible to scale without destroying everything we'd built together. August and September passed in an exhausting routine of vigilance and violation. Jonathan had settled into a pattern of visiting every few days, always with plausible excuses. He needed to discuss business matters that Daniel had asked him to handle. He wanted to borrow books. He was concerned about my health because I looked tired. His timing was impeccable. He never came when Daniel was home or when neighbors might be watching closely. The assault itself became almost secondary to the psychological torture of waiting for it. I would go days feeling almost normal, beginning to hope that maybe Jonathan had lost interest, that maybe the nightmare was over. Then I would hear his car in the driveway or his key in the lock, and the terror would crash over me anew. He had perfected the art of making each encounter seem consensual to any outside observer. He brought flowers, wine, gifts that a secret lover might bring. He stayed for exactly the right amount of time. Long enough to seem like a social visit, not so long as to appear suspicious. And he always left looking satisfied and content, like a man who had spent a pleasant evening with a willing partner. The photographs he had taken became his most powerful weapon. He never showed them to me directly, but he would reference them during his visits, describing in clinical detail what they revealed, how they could be interpreted, who might be interested in seeing them. "The one where you're reaching toward me looks particularly passionate," he would say conversationally while straightening his tie after another assault. "Anyone seeing that would assume you were welcoming my embrace." It was in early October, during what should have been a celebration of our first wedding anniversary, that I discovered I was pregnant. The morning sickness started subtly, just a slight queasy feeling when I smelled certain foods, a sensitivity to coffee that I attributed to stress. But when I missed my monthly cycle and the nausea became more pronounced, I could no longer deny what was happening. I sat in my bathroom staring at the pregnancy test I'd purchased in secret, watching the little plus sign appear, and feeling a complex mixture of joy and absolute terror. This should have been the happiest moment of my marriage. Daniel and I had talked about children from the beginning, and he was eager to start a family. But the timing couldn't have been worse. Kali. I was carrying a child, but I had no way of knowing who the father was. Kali. The mathematics were cruel and precise. Based on when I'd missed my cycle, conception would have occurred in late August or early September, right in the middle of the period when Jonathan had been assaulting me regularly. Daniel and I had been intimate during that time as well, but less frequently than usual due to his demanding work schedule and my own inability to respond normally to his touch. When I told Daniel about the pregnancy, his reaction was everything I could have hoped for under different circumstances. He swept me into his arms, tears streaming down his face, calling his parents immediately to share the news. "We're gonna have a baby," he shouted into the phone. "Maggie's pregnant." I could hear Thomas and Patricia's excited voices through the receiver, and within an hour they had arrived at our house with champagne and flowers, ready to celebrate what they saw as the next generation of the Mitchell legacy. Jonathan arrived with them, and I watched his face carefully as Daniel announced the news. For just a moment, something flickered in Jonathan's dark eyes. Surprise, calculation, maybe even satisfaction. Then his expression shifted to one of appropriate brotherly excitement. "Congratulations, brother," he said, embracing Daniel warmly. "You're going to be a wonderful father." When he turned to me, his hug lasted a fraction of a second too long, and he whispered something that only I could hear. "How exciting. We'll have to discuss this privately soon." The family celebration continued around us. Patricia immediately began planning nursery decorations. Thomas talked about setting up college funds. Daniel beamed with pride and happiness. And all I could think about was Jonathan's whispered words and what they might mean. Bowie. Nachlissa. I didn't have to wait long to find out. 2 days later, he appeared at my door with his usual confidence, but there was something different about his demeanor. An even more proprietary air, as if my pregnancy had somehow strengthened his claim over me. "So," he said, settling into Daniel's chair as if he belonged there, "we're going to be parents." "Daniel and I are going to be parents," I corrected firmly, though my voice shook. Jonathan's smile was cold and knowing. "Are you so sure about that?" "Because I've been doing some counting, and the timing is very interesting. Very ambiguous, you might say." The careful way he spoke told me that he had indeed been calculating dates, probably from the moment Daniel announced the pregnancy. And he had reached the same conclusion I had, that there was no way to know with certainty who had fathered this child. "It doesn't matter," I said desperately. "Daniel is my husband. This is his baby. Legally, perhaps. But biologically?" Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes fixed on mine with predatory intensity. "I think we both know that's much less certain. And you know what? I find that possibility absolutely fascinating." He stood and began pacing around my living room, his excitement barely contained. A Mitchell heir with my blood instead of Daniel's, my intelligence, my passion, my strength, raised by my weak, oblivious brother who would never suspect the truth. "You're sick," I whispered, but he either didn't hear or didn't care. "Of course, this does complicate things," he continued thoughtfully. A pregnant woman requires special care, special consideration. I'll need to be more gentle with you, at least for the next few months." The casual way he discussed continuing to assault me throughout my pregnancy made me feel physically ill. But then he said something that made my blood run completely cold. "And after the baby is born, well, we'll need to arrange for some very special bonding time. I'll want to spend a lot of time with my potential child, help shape their development. Daniel will be so busy with work that he'll be grateful for my involvement." The picture he was painting was horrific. A future where he would use this child, whether it was biologically his or not, as another weapon to control and torment me. A lifetime of having to watch him interact with my baby, never knowing if he was the father, never being able to prevent him from having access to the most precious thing in my world. "I won't let you," I said, surprising myself with the strength in my voice. "I'll tell Daniel everything before I let you anywhere near my child." Jonathan's laugh was genuinely amused. "With what proof? Those photographs I showed you before? The ones that clearly show you responding to my touch? The witnesses who've seen me visiting you regularly for months? Your own stories about women escaping their marriages?" He moved closer, and I instinctively placed my hands over my still flat stomach in a protective gesture that he noticed immediately. "Besides," he continued softly, "do you really want Daniel to spend the rest of his life wondering if the child he's raising belongs to his brother? Do you want to destroy his faith in you, his trust in his family, his joy in becoming a father? Because that's what telling him would accomplish. He'd never be able to look at this baby without wondering, never be able to trust you without remembering that you kept this secret for months." The terrible truth was that Jonathan was right. Even if Daniel believed my story about the assaults, the uncertainty about paternity would poison our marriage and his relationship with the child forever. And if he didn't believe me, if he thought I was making accusations to cover up an affair, it would destroy our family completely. "You're trapped, Maggie," Jonathan said gently, almost kindly. "More thoroughly trapped than you've ever been. Because now it's not just about protecting yourself or even your marriage. It's about protecting an innocent child from becoming a weapon in a war they didn't choose to be part of." He was right, and we both knew it. The pregnancy that should have been a blessing had become another chain binding me to silence, another lever he could use to ensure my compliance. Jonathan had found the perfect way to guarantee that I would never resist him again, by making my resistance a threat to my own child's future. As he prepared to leave that day, Jonathan paused at the door with one final observation. "You know, pregnancy suits you, Maggie. There's something beautiful about a woman carrying new life, even under complicated circumstances. I think the next few months are going to be very interesting for all of us." After he left, I sat in my empty house with my hands on my stomach, talking to the tiny life growing inside me. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry that your first months of existence are already overshadowed by this nightmare, but I promise you, somehow, some way, I'm going to find a way to protect you from all of this." I had no idea how I would keep that promise, but I knew that everything had changed. I wasn't just fighting for my own survival anymore. I was fighting for my child's future. And that realization, terrifying as it was, also gave me something I hadn't felt in months. A reason to keep hoping, keep planning, keep looking for a way out of this nightmare. The baby I was carrying might be the key to my destruction, but it could also become the motivation I needed to finally find the courage to fight back. The final confrontation came on a snowy evening in December 1966, when I was 7 months pregnant. Daniel was attending a company Christmas party at the Palmer House Hotel downtown, a black tie affair for Mitchell Construction's most important clients. I had planned to attend with him, but a bout of severe morning sickness that afternoon gave me the perfect excuse to stay home. What I didn't tell Daniel was that the sickness wasn't entirely natural. I had learned to make myself ill when necessary, a desperate survival skill that allowed me to avoid social situations where I might encounter Jonathan in public settings where I had to pretend everything was normal. I was resting in the nursery we'd been preparing, a sunny yellow room with white furniture and carefully chosen decorations that would work for either a boy or girl. Daniel had spent weeks assembling the crib, hanging pictures, and arranging toys with the dedication of a man who couldn't wait to become a father. Being in that room usually brought me peace, but tonight it felt like a sanctuary I might not be able to protect much longer. Jonathan's visits had become more frequent as my pregnancy progressed, not less. If anything, my growing vulnerability seemed to excite him. He would comment on the changes in my body with the possessive familiarity of someone who believed he had ownership rights. "You're glowing," he would say after each assault. "Pregnancy suits you. Motherhood is going to make you even more beautiful." I heard his key in the lock at 8 o'clock, right on schedule. Jonathan had become almost ritualistic in his timing, arriving precisely when he knew Daniel would be occupied elsewhere. But tonight something felt different. Maybe it was the way he moved through the house, or the particular intensity in his voice when he called my name. Whatever it was, every instinct I had developed over these horrible months told me that this encounter would be different from the others. I found him in the living room, pouring himself a drink from Daniel's liquor cabinet as if he owned the place. He was dressed in a tuxedo. Presumably he was supposed to be at the company party as well, but had chosen to come here instead. The formal wear made him look even more predatory, like a wolf in elegant clothing. "You missed quite a party," he said conversationally, not bothering to offer me a drink. He knew I wasn't drinking alcohol during the pregnancy. "Daniel gave a wonderful speech about the company's bright future. Very inspiring. He mentioned how grateful he is for my support during this important time in your lives." The casual way he twisted Daniel's innocent gratitude into something sordid made my stomach churn. "Why aren't you still there?" I asked. Jonathan's smile was cold and anticipatory. "Because tonight is special. Tonight we're going to settle some things between us once and for all." Something in his tone made me take an instinctive step backward. Throughout all of these months, Jonathan had maintained a certain pretense of seduction, as if he were convincing himself that I was a willing participant in some twisted romance. But tonight, that pretense was gone entirely. "Sit down, Maggie," he commanded, and when I hesitated, his voice turned sharp. I said, "Sit down." I lowered myself carefully into the armchair farthest from where he stood, my hands protectively cradling my rounded belly. The baby had been active all day, and I could feel small movements beneath my ribs, as if even this unborn child could sense the danger in the room. "I've been thinking about our situation," Jonathan began, pacing in front of the fireplace like a lawyer addressing a jury. "About the baby, about what happens after it's born, about how we're going to manage our relationship going forward." "There is no relationship between us," I said quietly but firmly. "There never was." Jonathan stopped pacing and turned to face me directly. "Don't lie to yourself, Maggie. We've been intimately connected for months now. We've created something together, whether you want to admit it or not." "You raped me," I said, the words coming out stronger than I'd expected. It was the first time I had spoken the truth so directly, and saying it aloud felt both terrifying and liberating. "Rape?" Jonathan's laugh was genuinely amused. "Is that what you call it? Because I have photographs that tell a very different story. I have witnesses who've seen me visiting you regularly. I have love letters you wrote. Oh yes, I found your drafts, the ones where you poured out your feelings about being trapped in your marriage, about wanting someone who truly understood you." My blood ran cold. He was talking about story fragments I'd written, fictional pieces about women in situations similar to mine, but in his hands, stripped of context, they could easily be interpreted as personal confessions. "After the baby is born," Jonathan continued, "things are going to change. I'll be moving back to the family house to help Father with the business expansion. That means I'll be around much more often, daily visits to see my nephew or niece. Babysitting when you and Daniel need time alone. Helping with bedtime stories and bath time and all those intimate family moments." The picture he was painting was my worst nightmare. A lifetime of having to watch him interact with my child, never knowing if he was the biological father, never being able to prevent his access or influence. He would use the child as a permanent weapon against me, and there would be nothing I could do to stop him without destroying Daniel's life and the baby's future. "And of course," Jonathan added with that predatory smile, "all that family time will give us plenty of opportunities to continue our special relationship. Maybe even expand the family further, Daniel would be so pleased to have multiple children close in age. That's when something inside me finally snapped. The idea of him assaulting me while my child slept in the next room, of potentially creating more children who would be pawns in his twisted game, of spending the rest of my life as his victim while my husband remained obliviously grateful for his brother's help. It was more than I could bear. "No," I said, standing up with more force than I'd used in months. "Absolutely not. I won't let you destroy my child's life the way you've destroyed mine." Jonathan's expression shifted from amusement to something darker. "You don't have a choice, Maggie. You lost the right to choose the first night you let me into this house." "I never let you in," I shot back. "You used a key that you obtained without permission. You forced yourself on me. You threatened my family and used your position to make reporting you impossible. But I'm done being your victim." I moved toward the telephone on the side table. Not entirely sure who I planned to call, but knowing that I had to take some kind of action. Jonathan was faster, grabbing my wrist and spinning me around to face him. "Don't do something you'll regret," he said quietly, but there was violence in his grip that hadn't been there before. "Think about what you're risking. Your marriage, your reputation, your child's future. All for what? Some misguided notion of justice?" "Let go of me," I said firmly, meeting his eyes directly for perhaps the first time since this nightmare began. Instead, Jonathan's grip tightened, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: pure, righteous anger. Not fear, not helplessness, but fury at what this man had stolen from me, from my marriage, from my unborn child. Without conscious thought, I brought my free hand up and slapped him across the face as hard as I could. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot, and Jonathan staggered backward, more from surprise than from the impact itself. "You bitch," he snarled, and for the first time, his careful mask completely dropped. I saw him as he really was. Not a charming, sophisticated young man, but a predator who had been playing with his food for too long. He lunged at me then, no longer bothering with pretense or seduction. But, as he reached for me, something extraordinary happened. The front door opened, and Daniel's voice called out through the house. "Maggie, I'm home early. The party was boring without you." Jonathan froze, his hands still reaching toward me, his face contorted with rage and frustration. For a split second, we both stood motionless, listening to Daniel's footsteps approaching the living room. In that moment of suspended time, I made the most important decision of my life. I was done protecting everyone except myself and my child. I was done preserving a peace that existed only because I absorbed all the violence and violation in silence. "Daniel!" I called out, my voice carrying a strength I didn't know I still possessed. "I need you in here right now." Daniel appeared in the doorway, still wearing his tuxedo from the party, his face bright with the afterglow of a successful evening. But his expression quickly changed as he took in the scene. Jonathan standing too close to me with his hands raised, my face flushed and my hair disheveled from our struggle, the electric tension that filled the room. "What's going on here?" Daniel asked slowly, his eyes moving from his brother to his wife. I looked at Jonathan, saw the calculation in his eyes, as he prepared to spin some story that would explain away what Daniel had almost witnessed. Then I looked at my husband. Good, decent Daniel, who trusted everyone and suspected no one, and I made my choice. "Your brother has been assaulting me for months," I said clearly. "Tonight he threatened to continue after our baby is born. I'm done staying silent to protect everyone but myself." The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. Daniel's face went white, then red, then white again as he processed what I had said. Jonathan opened his mouth to speak, probably to deploy the carefully constructed denials he'd been preparing for months. But Daniel didn't give him the chance. What happened next was swift and decisive. Daniel crossed the room in 3 strides and hit his brother with a force I didn't know he possessed. Jonathan went down hard, hitting the coffee table and sending the expensive bottle of wine he'd brought, another gift meant to support his narrative of romantic involvement, crashing to the floor. "Get out," Daniel said quietly, standing over his brother. "Get out of my house and don't ever come back." Jonathan struggled to his feet, blood trickling from his nose, his elegant facade completely shattered. "You're making a mistake, Daniel. Ask her about the photographs. Ask her about all those private dinners. Ask her about the stories she writes, the ones where she fantasizes about leaving you." "I said get out," Daniel repeated, his voice carrying a finality that even Jonathan couldn't mistake. As Jonathan gathered himself and stumbled toward the door, he looked back at me one last time. "This isn't over, Maggie. You have no idea what you've just done to your family." But for the first time in months, his threats felt empty, because I wasn't facing them alone anymore. After Jonathan left, Daniel and I sat together on our sofa, the same sofa where so many nightmares had begun, and I told him everything. Every assault, every threat, every photograph, every twisted justification. I showed him the hidden notes, described the calculated nature of Jonathan's campaign, explained how his own loving concern for me had been weaponized against us both. Daniel cried as I spoke, tears of rage, guilt and grief for the innocence we had both lost. "I should have seen it," he kept saying. "I should have protected you." "You couldn't have known," I replied, though part of me would always wonder if things might have been different if I had found the courage to speak sooner. The weeks that followed were difficult in ways I hadn't anticipated. Jonathan's exile from our family created ripple effects throughout the Mitchell empire. Thomas was furious, not just at his younger son's actions, but at the scandal that threatened the family's reputation. Patricia retreated into denial, insisting that there must have been some misunderstanding, some way to interpret events that didn't make her son a criminal. But Daniel stood firm. He made it clear that Jonathan would never be welcome in our home or around our child. He changed all the locks, increased security at Mitchell Construction to prevent Jonathan from accessing company properties, and even hired a private investigator to document any attempts at harassment or intimidation. The photographs Jonathan had threatened me with never materialized, whether because they didn't exist, because he'd destroyed them, or because he realized that using them would only provide evidence of his crimes. I never knew. Our daughter Emily was born in March 1967, a perfect, healthy baby with Daniel's kind eyes and my stubborn chin. The question of paternity that had tormented me throughout the pregnancy became irrelevant the moment Daniel held her for the first time. She was ours, completely and unconditionally, regardless of biology. Jonathan never attempted to claim any relationship with Emily, or to pursue the threats he'd made during that final confrontation. Perhaps Daniel's decisive response had finally convinced him that his games were over. Or perhaps he had simply moved on to other victims, other families to torment. I learned later that he left Chicago entirely within 6 months of that December night, reportedly moving to Europe where Thomas's business connections helped him establish a new life far from the consequences of his actions. We never saw or heard from him again. The trauma didn't disappear overnight, of course. I suffered from nightmares for years, jumping at unexpected sounds, struggling with intimacy even with my loving husband. But with Daniel's support and eventually the help of a therapist, something quite progressive for 1967, I slowly rebuilt my sense of safety and self-worth. More importantly, I found my voice again. Not just the voice that had finally stood up to Jonathan, but my writing voice, my authentic voice that refused to be silenced by fear or shame. I began writing about women's experiences, about survival and resistance, about the strength that can emerge from the darkest places. In 1972, my first book was published, a collection of stories about women finding their power in impossible circumstances. It wasn't a bestseller, but it reached the women who needed to read it, the ones who recognized their own struggles in my fictional characters. Today, at 79 years old, I look back on that time as the period when I truly learned what courage means. It doesn't mean not being afraid. I was terrified every day for months. Courage means deciding that some things are worth the risk of speaking truth to power, even when that power seems insurmountable. My daughter Emily grew up to become a lawyer specializing in women's rights. She never knew the full details of her early story until she was an adult, but somehow she absorbed the lesson that silence in the face of injustice is not an option. She fights for women who find themselves in situations similar to mine, women who feel trapped by circumstances and systems designed to keep them quiet. The young woman who was assaulted in that suburban living room could never have imagined that her story would eventually help other women find their own voices. But that's the strange alchemy of survival. Sometimes our deepest wounds become the source of our greatest strength, not just for ourselves, but for everyone whose path crosses ours in the aftermath. Jonathan Mitchell stole many things from me: my innocence, my sense of safety, months of my life that I can never reclaim. But he couldn't steal my determination to ensure that other women wouldn't suffer in silence the way I did. And in the end, that determination proved stronger than all his threats, all his power, all his calculated cruelty. The woman speaking to you today is living proof that even in our darkest moments, when we feel most powerless and alone, we carry within us the seeds of our own liberation. Sometimes it just takes longer than we hope to find the right conditions for those seeds to grow. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.